It's so great to see everybody coming on. Look at all these faces and so many people I know. And if you'd like to just put where you're from in the chat, sometimes it's fun to see where everybody's zooming in from. And I will get started in just a minute. I think we've got almost everybody admitted from the waiting room. I'm sure some people will come in as we get rolling, but I don't want to take any time away from today's program. So I'll just get started. I'm Meg Weston. I'm the founder and host of the Poets Corner, and I want to welcome you back. We were quiet for the month of August, but we're making up for it this fall with so many wonderful events and craft talks, including today's reading. For those of you who are new, 2025 is the 5th anniversary of the founding of the Poets Corner. And 5 years ago, I never would have imagined it would be the size and scale or the community that we've built in this time. There are over 8,000 people in our community, and we've been doing this free Sunday reading series for, I think, 63 months now. We include emerging writers as well as the distinguished poets that we have here with us today. My nephew, Lucas Adair, has been our incredibly competent technical host since the very start. And this past year, I was joined by the talented Liz Collick as our strategy and design director. A few words about upcoming events before we get started on today's program. On September 21st, we have a craft talk on the lyric essay with Heidi Serwick, who wrote, I think, the original book on the craft of the lyric essay. You'll definitely want to sign up for that if you're interested in the form. And then on September 23rd, in partnership with the Malay House in Rockland, Maine, we'll be hosting Conversations with Dead Poets. Okay, the dead poets aren't coming on. We're not using any AI magic, but we have 4 contemporary poets and writers talking about those poets who have passed. We have Julia Bousma, who's the Poet Laureate of Maine, talking about Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she actually lives on a property where there's a cemetery of some of Millay's relatives. And she's been writing about that. Rosa Lane has been writing in response to Emily Dickinson's poems. Sama Abdurraqib is going to be talking about June Jordan. And A.O. Scott, the New York Times critic, will be on talking about Thomas Gunn. Not to be missed, there's a live event if you're here in Rockland, Maine, but there's a Zoom event that anybody can join and sign up on our website. And in October, on our second Sunday reading, Jane Hirschfield will return to the Poets Corner for a solo reading. And also in October, we'll be launching our 5th annual Ekphrastic Challenge in partnership with the Page Gallery. They will post an exhibition online and in their gallery physically. And there will be poets selected by the Poets Corner and a separate set of poets selected by each of the artists in the exhibition. So there'll be a over Zoom reading in November on the Poets Corner and a live reading in the gallery in November as well. And this year, a printed chapbook in honor of the 5th anniversary with selections from over the years. You can find all those on our website, thepoetscorner.org. So let's dig into the pleasure of today's guests. Melissa McKinstry, Diane Seuss, and Mark Doty. Our reading is entitled Poets Past and Present, and each of the three poets joining us will read from their own work and talk about one or more of the poets who have influenced them. I'm going to introduce each of them when it's their turn to read. They'll read for a while, and then we'll highlight the group for a further conversation about how other poets have influenced their personal trajectory. Knowing each of these folks, I have no doubt that we'll learn quite a few more things about the legacy of poetry this afternoon. So, and we'll have a chance, you can put your questions in the chat when we get to that point, and I'd be happy to scan the chat and ask some of our poets to answer some of your questions as well. So let's get started with Melissa McKinstry. Melissa was the inaugural writer in residence at the Millay House in Rockland in October of 2024 and selected by the judge who was Mark Doty. And it's such a pleasure to have them both together on the Poets Corner today. Melissa, I think, is a rising star in the world of poetry. Having completed her MFA degree at Pacific University in 2022, she's gone on to engage with the world of poets and poetry in meaningful ways. She hosts quarterly poetry and jazz evenings, curates a community poetry tree in San Diego, serves as a research and production assistant for the poet Ellen Bass, and is now on the Millay House board as well. Her poetry appears in many journals, including Beloit, Adroit, and the Best New Poets of 2023. She's been recently selected for her 2026 Pushcart Prize and was selected by the poet Ted Kooser as the 2025 New Ohio Review Poetry Contest winner. I know that Melissa approaches poetry with the same kind of generosity and enthusiasm that she radiates in the world. So please join me in welcoming Melissa McKinstry.
Thank you so much, Meg. I'm so happy to be here with you and the Poets Corner tech artist, Lucas Adair, and two of my poetry heroes, Diane and Mark. Natasha Trethewey, the American poet, once said, "We need the truth of poetry and its beauty now more than ever." And that feels so true to me every day. So I'm always grateful for an opportunity to be included in a thriving poetry ecosystem such as the Poets Corner. Our topic today is poems written in response to poets or poems we love, as Meg mentioned. So between reading a few of my own poems, I'll talk a bit about poets who've helped me do something I'm going to call luring chaos into meaning. About 10 years ago, I read Jane Hirshfield's wonderful and wise collection of essays, 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. And one essay titled Uncarryable Remainders, Poetry and Uncertainty, made a particular impression on me. In this essay, Jane tells of winter solstice 1817, when John Keats was writing letters to his brothers. One such letter included his concept of what he called negative capability, and he explained that is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. I admit I've certainly done my share of irritable reaching after fact and reason in my life, but I was curious to understand ways of being in uncertainty. Perhaps in our own times, most of us feel uncertainty pressing on us. In this essay, Jane Hirshfield says, that anxiety, grief, and the abysses of chaos can be lured into beauty and meaning and into the freedom such transmutation itself brings is no small part of literature's power. So, an ongoing question for my own reading and writing has been, how do we pull off this alchemy? How do we lure chaos into meaning and maybe even into beauty? Jane's essay led me to try. So, this first poem I'm going to read is one I wrote about a daily ritual with my son that was both harrowing and beautiful. This poem is called Showering My Son. Now over 100 pounds, your soft body, like the lead drape a technician places before an x-ray. Like Titian's Venus of Urbino, white and pink, sans all that hair, sans the sentience in the eyes. Every day for almost 24 years, my arms under your shoulder blades and knees, I scoop you out of bed, pivot you to the blue mesh chase on wheels. Your three stomata, a constellation from throat to belly to bladder. Oh, the way plastic meets the flesh, our little mystery, our science experiment, our boy. Let us wheel to the shower now. I'll sluice warm water over your chest, little tuft of hair. I'll lift each arm and rinse your musky man odor. I'll soap your groin, your legs, and your rocker bottom feet with those toes crossed for good luck. I'll shampoo your hair, a sort of translucence. I'll shave your chin, press a warm cloth gently to each eye, the whorl of each ear, the nape of your neck under the trach tie. And then the swaddle of towels, the wheeling back to bed, and will become After the Bath by Degas, the hairbrush and the awkward limbs. I'll lotion your knobby knees, thin shins, each little finger that has never held anything. I'll fluff your pillow, cover you with your old soft blanket, read you a poem. I'll be Frank O'Hara, made for the lunchtime ritual of the city, made for kangaroos, aspirins, beachheads, and beers. These things are with us every day, he says, made for the daily touch, for the reminder. You really are beautiful, he says. And those lines of Frank O'Hara's, or words of Frank O'Hara's, come from his poem Today, which is available online at the Library of Congress website. Because I mothered a child who was disabled and medically complex, I sought other poets who also shared this incertitude. I read many who were parenting children with uncertain prognoses. One of these, Danusha Lamaris, showed me how a poem can convey experience without self-pity or sentimentality. Her poetry showed me the power of letting carefully selected detail hold emotion. I was so fortunate to take a workshop with the thoughtful and generous Danusha. And during our time together, she said something that I think is so smart and true, and I think about it often. She said, readers want to eavesdrop on another human being having a human experience, something important. People want to feel less alone, want to feel accompanied. People turn to writing to gain a sense of how to survive intact with some kind of joy. So Danusha's poems about her own son's uncertain health and eventually his death, and her own brother's death, and how to survive intact have often inspired me. Another steady source of inspiration for me has been my mentor, Ellen Bass. During the pandemic, Ellen gave a craft talk on ekphrastic poetry, that is, poetry that's in conversation with a piece of art, and her words stuck with me. She said, one of the primary reasons you might want to write an ekphrastic poem is to allow yourself to say something that wouldn't be as deep or powerful or communal if you'd not approached through the painting. And I'll add to Ellen's quote to say, I think ekphrasis has even allowed me to say something that I might not have otherwise even been able to whisper. So that's what happened for me after visiting an amazing touring exhibition of Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore's work. I was so taken with the exhibit, which included a replica of O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch studio, that I went back twice. I came face to face with her artwork, yes, but also maybe more importantly for me, the artifacts from her life and studio space. these small details that helped me write the next poem that I'll read. And this poem is titled Late Spring Epiphany after the Georgia O'Keeffe exhibit. I'm always trying to paint that door. I never quite get it, she said, of the black square at her winter house in Abiquiu. Always a shadow shifting, a ladder leading to sky. When she looked through a pelvic bone she picked up in the desert, she saw a ghost moon. And today I'm quiet as her bones and stones and black pearl oyster shells. Once I had a son. Once, when he was 4, before his tracheotomy, we were invited to float in a warm therapy pool. He was weightless as I swirled his thin limbs in slow circles and lines. He seemed to sleep through it all, but I loved it. His buoyancy, absence of straps and wheels, water flicker on his curly lashes, maybe a quiver of smile. He couldn't say more or or get me out of here. So I don't really know. I never really knew him. He kept himself to himself, maybe grew very small to survive. He was a dark door, a box of bones, a soft, gone tabernacle. Ekphrasis was a gift for me with this poem. It invited me to be in Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch and the world of O'Keeffe's paintings, her obsessions, in order to explore details of my own obsessions. With the ongoing mentorship of Ellen Bass, I began to more fully understand how the reality of uncertainty could be held without sentimentality or explanation by pressing, testing, and interrogating detail, syntax, imagery, and diction. Ellen also taught me that each poem needs to work toward discovery and leave space to invite readers into discovery as well. She demonstrates this in her poems over and over again with both precision and generosity. And I've particularly fallen in love with what Ellen calls the long-armed poem. Of this form, she says, a certain kind of poem reaches out long arms and sweeps disparate, unexpected things into its net. It doesn't hug the shore. It doesn't walk a narrow line. It retains a kind of wildness. And yet all the elements have enough magnetic attraction, enough resonance that the poem feels organically whole. The next poem I'm going to read is both a long-armed poem and an ekphrastic poem, and it was written in response to a beautifully intricate jigsaw puzzle of Vasily Kandinsky's painting titled Dominant Curve. This is Ways to Wear It. Put your arms through the sleeves of this Bauhaus swirl. Let it drape from your shoulders, a shawl of distraction in abstraction. Kandinsky's dominant curve. Feel the fine seams of your private mourning, the silky sway of teabag brown, sage green. Let yourself be satin amidst bisecting angles and arcs. You might find a hidden pocket. You might hold on to what isn't. When my son was young, no one knew why the toggle of his jeans didn't fit. I kept slippering down hallways to brush my teeth in fluorescence, the smell of hospital soap deep in my skin. Each day, a moving staircase of dread with a hair's breadth handrail, a repeating pattern of unpredictability, cut on the bias, selvage edged. His small, misshapen head, tiny, useless feet curved like lyres, little hands always infant dimpled. When he died 26 years later, he was still surreal. But let me tell you about his eyes. Blue riders, blue mountains, blue roses. He was the dominant curve of my life. Somehow, Kandinsky painted it all. So I clipped a jigsaw of it together over and over after the after. the dining room table like a wall at the Guggenheim, this canvas, my favorite kimono. If this piece feels soft and worn to you too, pull it closer, shrug it up around your neck. It's quiet inside these colors, a place you can hear how things were. All those sharp pins and needles tacked these shapes together to be basted, then stitched, hemming in what I couldn't believe. I was going to live a life impossibly imperfect, full of chaos, full of not knowing, full of my son's suffering. I was going to live a life designed by a dominant curve. Kandinsky said, everything starts from a dot. And this takes me back to Jane Hirshfield's essay, Uncarryable Remainders, Poetry and Uncertainty. And I'll close with this quote from her. She says, to exchange certainty for praise of mystery and doubt is to step back from hubris and stand in the receptive, both vulnerable and exposed. Thank you so much for including me today.
Melissa, that was just so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We're gonna move right along, although it's hard to absorb that and move, right? But that's what we do. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Diane Seuss today. And when Mark suggested that we invite Diane to be part of today's reading, I was bowled over. Of course, I said yes. I had heard Diane at the Dodge Poetry Festival online and read her work over the past few years, but had no previous connection. So I'm excited, along with all of you, to have her read and talk with us today. She'll be reading from her latest book, Modern Poetry, published in 2024, that was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her previous book, Frank Sonnets, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, amongst other honors. She's a visiting professor at the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan and at Washington University in St. Louis. And her seventh collection, Althea Poems, is forthcoming from Grey Wolf Press in 2027. So I hope, Diane, you'll come back and read from that when that's out again. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Poets Corner.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Melissa, too, for that beautiful reading and those comments. Today, I'm going to, we're talking about influences. And so I decided to read a couple poems from modern poetry that focus on John Keats and his influence on my way of thinking about poems and my way of thinking about poets' lives, my own life and my father's life. And I'll just dig in. I want to thank Meg Weston and Mark, Doty, and Melissa McKinstry for sharing this space with me. And of course, all of you who showed up on a Sunday afternoon, thank you. So this poem is called Romantic Poetry, and you'll see it's very fluid. It takes me to Keats' deathbed. Romantic poetry. Now that the TV is gone and the music has been hauled away, it's just me here and the muffling silence. A spider wraps around a living morsel, and at times, often the unbearable. I bear it, though, just like you. Long ago, I bore a suitcase filled with books, bore it far on city streets to sell, I guess, at some used book place, one of those doorways down steps into darkness and dankness, the scent of mildewed, dog-eared, fingered pages. The suitcase, big and square and sharp-cornered, covered in snakeskin, bought at Goodwill for $1, knowing I had some traveling to do, some lugging, and I was right. What books I sold, I do not know. Maybe that's where modern poetry went. The cover cherry red and blossom white. I can see its spine in my mind's eye, pointing downward beneath the dank and the dark to the water tunneling under the city and making its way to the river. Poems sliding down the book's spine into water. The shock of the cold and dank down where my uterine lining, my blood and cast-off ovulations, cast-off fetal tissue swims below the city. The micro-dead ride modern poems like swan boats in the park, from the park to the river to the sea. I'm thinking now of P.J. Harvey and Nick Cave, balladeers, lovers, Vida and Virginia, Frank O'Hara and Vincent Warren. Somehow we ride our lost loves out to sea, or they ride us. It doesn't matter. Poet or poem or reader, the same ectoplasm. The modern in time becomes antique, and the stone faces of the dead convert to symbols, ripe for smashing. Come to think of it, symbols are terrible. As the tyrant shouted to the masses, part of his brainwashing campaign, I know it and you know it too. I was 23 when I sold off modern poetry and sailed to Italy, seeking romantic poetry, which was at one time modern, and found my way to Rome and Keats' death room. His deathbed, a facsimile. Everything he touched was burned to kill what killed him. I lifted his death mask from its nail, cradled it, closed my eyes, and kissed his lips until the plaster warmed and stained his face with the lipstick on my lips, red as the cover of modern poetry. The color of the droplets of arterial blood he coughed onto his sheets and viewed by candlelight. Then he knew he was done for. His death warrant, he called it. After those many kisses over his face and eyes, and the reticulated eyelashes, cold and tangled, my lips were blossom white, my face chalked, like I'd caught something from him. And I don't just mean consumption, though my lungs burned for years. They still burn. This is the danger of the ecstasy of kissing the dead or dying poet on the mouth. The disease you'll catch, well, it changes you. The tingle in the spine, the erotic charge will be forever married to poetry's previous incarnations. It's why marriage itself never worked for me. I kept wanting to get to the part where death parts us and I could find myself again. Keats made such a compact corpse, only 5 feet tall, shorter than Prince, and intricately made. Always he was working it out, the meaning of suffering, the world's, his own, the encounter with beauty, nearly synonymous with suffering, how empathy could extinguish him and he could set down the suitcase at last, or finally deliver him to himself, distinct as the waves in his hair and the bridge of his nose. How auspicious, rare, lush, bizarre, kinky, transcendent, romantic to be young, just 23, and to cradle him in my arms as we listened to the burbling water of the Fontana della Barcaccia from the open window. I want to be very aware of time. So I think I'll just read one more, and it's called High Romance. That's from a Keats poem, and he's revisiting Fanny Braun, the love of his life, and reconsidering as a ghost what love might be. High Romance. And then Keats' ghost found that he could no longer love Fanny Braun. He'd escaped the body like a love letter from its envelope, and he'd flown like a love letter in a windstorm. He'd seen that the words formed from ink melted in the rain. Words, he now knew, and he'd once been such a devotee, didn't matter, or didn't matter so much as he believed they'd mattered. Something mattered, he knew, but whatever it was, he couldn't put words to it, or he didn't have the heart to put words to it. He did feel love, but it was an arrow without a target. It was diffuse, like an atomized perfume, or stars as the poor see them who cannot afford glasses. He saw that Fanny, as she was known, was a concept, just as he had been a concept. They each inhabited the same amount of space, like a tablespoon of butter and a tablespoon of lard. In a single book, they would each occupy a single page. Their brains, encased in cranial bones and flesh and heads of hair, could each rest on a single silk pillow. Ideas, he found, don't die. Even notions fly like cottonwood seeds through the air. And love had been a notion. He saw that Fanny in time would slip free of herself. Everything does in time, even roses, even stones, foothills, fleas, and poems. Rhyme, he saw, existed on its own behalf. He could catch it like a bird catches an air current. From above, he could see that Fanny was not trifling. Nothing from above is trifling, nor more compelling than anything else. His love for her, he saw, had been an invention of the mind. Only belief could sustain it, but he could no longer sustain belief. Now and then he'd try it on again. Love, like a fancy hat he could not afford, and now appeared ludicrously overdesigned. Once his ghost managed to look at her again through the gauzy curtains that hung over her bedroom window. His gaze was too objective to find her beautiful. But objectivity itself, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Wonderful, Diane. Thank you so much for reading these poems. And maybe if there's time at the end, we'll squeeze in one more because I hate to not get them all, right? So moving right along, I get to introduce Mark Doty. And it's wonderful to do this because I just finished doing a week-long workshop with Mark. And it was so incredible. So I just want to thank you, Mark. You know, I know him as the author of poetry and prose, including memoirs like Dog Years, Firebeat Heaven's Coast. I haven't read yet a book of criticism, The Art of Description, World into Word, but after this week's workshop, I've ordered it. And his book-length essay that's a favorite of almost everyone I meet, Still Life with Oysters and Lemon, and a memoir that centers on his poetic relationship with Walt Whitman, entitled What is the Grass? He's also just happens to be the author of 9 books of poetry, including Deep Lane, Fire to Fire, which won the National Book Award in 2008, and others. His deep knowledge and familiarity with so much poetry that he can recall on his fingertips on almost any topics that we would raise, as well as his generosity in giving feedback and sharing insights and willingness to follow this group of students wherever it led for a week. I feel quite privileged to have spent that week getting to know him and then to follow it up with having him on the Poets Corner today. So please join me in welcoming Mark Doty.
Thank you, Meg. I feel honored to be here, to be in your good company, and to read with Diane and Melissa, who are marvelous, really extraordinary poets. And I guess I think that poems never exist in isolation. Every poem has its links and ties to the other poems. How do we know what a poem is or what it can be except by reading them and checking them into ourselves and through some kind of alchemical process? We choose or we find something like ourselves, the kind of poems we want to make, and begin to craft them. So I think were there, a sort of medical research device where you could put in a poem and, turn it around and separate the strands of its DNA, you could ascertain where poems come from, and to some degree. And this one comes from an early influence who I honestly, as an adult, never thought would be an influence, and that's E.E. Cummings, who I loved when I was about 15 and carried selected poems around with me everywhere. And in retrospect, I think what I loved about him was the passion, the certainty, because Cummings never doubts himself. He makes very plain, unambiguous statements, and adolescents love those. And also, of course, the wordplay, which is dazzling and kind of inherently rebellious. It breaks syntax as we know it. It makes meaning in new ways. If you know his poem Grasshopper, marvelous little thing which rearranges the letters of the word until ultimately it arrives at resemblingly grasshopper, spelling it correctly. It's a marvelous game. So this poem is about or emerges out of being newly in love in New York City, in love with the coming of spring, in love with the incredible energy that comes from a new relationship, and is interested in breaking up language in a way that has something to do with Cummings, lots of interruption. It's called Bodega. Tulip 2 Bunch 12 at the Bodega, corner of 19th Street, January just begun. Hand-inked signs above metal tubs sporting this panoply of shades whose curve and surface rhyme with the skin of his shoulders. 2 of the uncounted places on, let's call them you, where my hands like to rest. I've studied the spectrum of possibility displayed beneath a striped, rain-glazed awning and made my choice. 3 branches of plum, decked at their tips with spherical green, ideas of bloom. To purchase a bud is to buy a prospect, to entertain belief. He'll be at my place in an hour, just off work. The bit of future I'm carrying home is bundled in clear wrapping and jeweled with a little rain, a gift given as much to myself as to, let's say, you. Unwrap these and open, unexpected, early in the year, later in my life, long in coming, though sudden still and splendid, spring. So, some years later, like just a couple of years ago now, I left New York City after 21 years, and I moved to a farm in upstate New York, way up in the Hudson Valley. And that landscape has just now, after 2 years, really begun to show itself in my poems. It's like, when you move somewhere, your dreams stay in the old place for a while. And I felt that way about my language. And I'm just now finding a way into speaking about this place that is a complete change for me. So this is called Aftermath. Even before the storm passed, I could see what became of my emblems of permanence. 2-century-old maples split clean down the middle, fallen halves sprawled on the grass like ruined steeples. And my 2 lindens, paired domes so densely leaved they seemed made entirely of shadow. That morning wind bent each into a huge dark green sail and bent the trunks till they snapped right to the ground. And the bees, city of their hopes disordered, boxes half unstacked under an elderly apple tree. Stripped bare now, askew, branches akimbo, the hive's white roof blown where? A single drop of rain can end a bee. 6 minutes of low, ceaseless thunder, absurd, wrong, 11 o'clock in the morning, blind swirl of heat tearing at the garden, only my second summer here. How could I have assumed any measure of ongoingness? Outlive me, I said to the sentinels, the elder maples who shade one side of this house, and knew their answer. We already have. Then, after a moment, and we will. How could I have thought of these trees as mine? I turned toward the hive. All those ancient cities, dwellings cut from rock and the live flanks of mountainsides, if they were empty now, what of dwellings of wax? I know what happens to such mansions. One drop can finish a bee, and for a few endless minutes, rain sheeted, hostile and stinging down into the open frames. But the damp weight of the air shifted slightly, yards from the wreck, skittering wind and last droplets giving way to an unsteady humming. The suggestion of a sound, mounting and falling, lifting again, a wave, maybe 1,000 bees, more, stirring air with their wings, drying the hive, not flying, but holding in place, producing a vibration disproportionate to their size, and not unlike that background static astronomers record in silent, airless regions, buzzing left over from the origin of time. The bees were, at that moment, chorusing a future into being, making more of time. Can a sound be said to glow? So, what's in the DNA of that poem? I think certainly Elizabeth Bishop, who produced this marvelous kind of hat trick of showing us how she feels and what she thinks about by how she sees. You really paying such close attention to how the world looks to her. And through that look comes so much understanding and so much information, comes meaning, really. So I didn't know, I knew I was thinking about time, but I didn't know I was thinking about where the future comes from, when this, or how much I need a future until well into composing this poem. So this next poem, last one, touches upon the future too. And this is a poem that has its roots in all kinds of places. One of them is Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose beautiful sonic textures sing towards the core of things, towards what we might call sacred or divine. Another source are those incredible images that came back from the Webb telescope, and how haunted everyone I knew was so struck by those images. We want to talk about them and think about them. Incredible photographs from so long ago, so far away, and such ravishing beauty. It also grows out of Bishop, who's quoted here. That going by. And I like this idea of planting quotations from poets you love in your own poems. So you'll hear that. I think it's from The Moose. There's a little bit of quote from Hayden Carruth in here, a wonderful underread poet. And finally, there's a piece of an old dance song, which those of you who are going out in the 90s will remember. It's a song called Finally, that was sung by C.C. Peniston. Finally, it's happened to me. And there's a line of that song I love so much that's in this poem. One more thing. You are familiar with Poetry in Motion, the program that puts poems on the subways, buses, trains. That gets in here too. Drink of water. Immortal diamond. Those gorgeous photographs the new telescope sends back feel consoling now. Grand processes happening without us on the edge of this era and every other. Beauty how long ago, how impossibly far away. Which may be why the lit up announcement on the signboard parked outside my corner bodega rankles so. The nearest galaxy like ours is 15 million light years away. A sudden window opened on vastness we won't ever cross. Which may be why a guy on the A train, off his meds or fueled on liquid oblivion, is pounding on a poem framed under plastic on the car's metal wall, really wailing on it, backing up, hurling himself forward, forearms and fists smashed against the text over and over, while he moans with such abandon we've ceded half the car to him. Maybe he read that sign too, and knowing it's 15 million years at light speed before you're any place remotely like home makes any poem worse. I don't dare get close enough to read it, but I admit I'm starting to hate it too, for what it probably doesn't do. We're just trying to hold the morning a little steady here, get ourselves to work nearly on time, and somebody writes a poem that doesn't make the distance between a stanza and the stars feel one bit smaller. And somebody has the nerve to publish it on the train where you can't help but read it, even if it isn't brave or reckless enough to name our situation or say why we all feel, so singular and discontent. I can't write that poem either. Nothing commensurate with the misery of a citizen who beats a hapless lyric to pulp and shatter, his hands cut by shards of plastic, scraps of text falling to the floor. Is the poem better, marked by the blood of a reader who demanded the best of it? I want to tell you what I learned. Looking at photos of ancient starlight, 7 decades into my life, what reconfigured the night for me? An immense telescope traced the origin of waves from far out, a brief stream of pattern beats that would vanish, then begin again, intentional, a code announcing the presence of what might wish to say hello across a black rippling distance we can barely imagine. The source, the flicker of starlight interrupted as a huge planet closely orbited the star, a planet entirely composed of carbon, compressed by its own weight, and by the proximity of that star. You know what happens to pressurized carbon. One vast diamond, surface blackened by debris from the winds of space, and beneath that, an immense clarity shot through with those flaws and stresses that write any gleam more visible, a grand poem containing the light of its star and every other, and thus all of time held in that sphere, endless. Here I stop. How can I, in the warm and private cavern of this body, how can I describe this? Do you remember that superb dance song years back when the diva sings that love has come to her finally, her voice swooping down as if flashing across dismissible realms toward the single term of arrival, announcing what seems unsayable and of the spirit? And though we know spirit through the agency of the body, the flesh cannot circumscribe it, which is why she sings, enchanted, my 2 lips can't describe it. As if to say, here I am, in the limits of my skin, but that limitless is not far from me. I speak from this body that tears at the poem until my hands bleed, but I am no stranger to the sway of those grand choruses along which time makes its music, even if my tongue shapes only the vague outline of those sounds. It doesn't matter that no one will ever go there, or see inside that pulse's source, or read that light to the end should it have one. Diamond intact, close enough to forever, not ours. And if it signals, it's only to tell us or anyone it's there. It is there. It is so. You and I, wherever we are proximate. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Mark. Geez, this has just been so wonderful to hear all of you read. And now we're going to gather the 4 of us on the screen, if we can do that, and have a bit of more conversation. And we'll start taking some questions from the chat around 5 o'clock. So think about what you want to ask and go ahead and put it in the chat. Although there was one, Mark, that somebody was asking if all these poems were in one collection, and I don't believe that's true. I know one has not yet been published, right?
None of those poems are in a collection yet.
Okay.
I've been holding on to poems for a long time, and I've now just about finished a book of poems, which it's difficult when you work on a book for forever because the poems don't feel so connected sometimes. But this book is geographically connected. The poems all have to do with New York City, and then the newest poem here, which is the one about the storm aftermath, it is not yet published.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we can't wait till that book comes out, right?
Out there, I'm obsessive.
That's great. Well, I'd love to just open up this conversation about sort of that DNA that you spoke about, Mark, that comes into us from other poems and poets that we read and how it works our way into our own poetry. And Diane, I might start just with some questions about how you discovered John Keats. Like, how old were you? And why did he or his life become such a profound influence for you?
Yeah, I can't remember where I first heard his name, but I think it was when, after my father died when I was 7, my mom went to college and she ended up getting an English degree to teach. And she brought books into the house that would have not been there otherwise. And one of them said the Romantic Poets, and then it said Byron, Keats, and Shelley, I believe. And I had no idea what any of that meant, but I thought, romantic. I knew what that meant. So that's probably where I first heard of him. But I think reading the passage that Melissa read about negative capability and then reading what some say was the last thing he wrote or toward the end, and it's a little fragment in the margin of a longer poem he was working on. Some call it This Living Hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou wouldst wish thine own heart dried of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and thou be conscience calmed. See, here it is. I hold it toward you. And that got me where I live, you know. I mean, the dead body of my father, and my father is sort of an artifact of my childhood. His body itself is an artifact of our relationship. And the fact that I love the anger in Keats' fragment, that he's pissed that he's dying. And he's saying, listen up, reader. I like that firmness. It is within your power to give me life again by paying attention. Read the poems. Here's my hand. I hold it toward you. Well, he can hold it all he wants, but we have to touch back by reading him. Something about that generated all that in modern poetry and in poems that came before. I feel like my connection to him is more imaginative than from sort of actually studying him. I studied him a bit in college, I think I say in one of the poems in modern poetry, when I needed Keats, I got him. And when I'd gotten what I needed, I left the rest behind. I mean, that's how a self-educated person operates. And so I got what I needed. But really, what I needed was him. It was just him. His, dying young and his anger and his his despair that he would not be remembered. And my father had that same despair.
Mm.
So they resonate for me, as Frank O'Hara resonated in my book before this one, Frank Sonnets, for in some ways for the same reason, in some ways not.
I love how visceral, how alive that relationship appears to be for you with the Frank O'Hara, with the Keats and the Romantics, and that it's not. I think you said when I needed you, I got what I needed from
Mm-hmm.
you, and I recall something that you said to me, Mark, when I said I don't have a huge background in poetry and in, past poetry. And you said you will discover that you go and you find what you need and you absorb it because you needed it. So,
Mm-hmm.
but you have this vast, collection. I mean, I think there were 3 or 4 different poets you mentioned, from Whitman to Bishop to E. Cummings, and another one that you mentioned, all weaving into these poems. Can you talk a little bit about how that happens for you?
Well, first, before I do that, I want to respond to something Diane said, because I was thinking about
Yeah.
Whitman's invitation to readers next to Keats and This Living Hand. Whitman assumes that you're gonna agree. He just, there's not that element of anger. It's just, stop with me this day and night, and you shall possess the secret of all poems. Or, I stop somewhere waiting for you. It's a really interestingly different gesture, because it's not, it doesn't push us away exactly. He just assumes our complicity, which some readers kind of can't stand about him. It's too familiar and too certain that he'll draw you in. So where did all that reading come from? I started writing poetry, really caring about it in high school. I stumbled upon Cummings, Blake, and Garcia Lorca, and those poems just lifted me out of the everyday, and they lifted me out of particular circumstances at home, which were not a place I wanted to linger at that point. And I just lucked out. I had a high school drama teacher who said that we should perform something that we had written, and I brought in his poems and spoke it, and he said, "No, it's something you wrote." And so he wound up showing my poems to a wonderful poet named Richard Shelton, who taught at the university in Tucson, where I lived in. And Shelton invited me to come down to the Poetry Center, and it was sort of a magic territory, or a Wunderkammer. It was this little OW house, and you open the door, and there were photographs of poets and recordings and books, walls and walls full of books. Couldn't take them out, but you could stay there and read anytime you wanted to, and it was such a refuge to me. And there was a person who embodied and the human capacity to center your life around the practice of an art. And he was holding the door open to me, and I sort of never looked back. I felt I had been welcomed into a community, and I've sort of felt that ever since. So rereading poetry is just a way of feeling part of your times, and feeling part of the times before you, and feeling that ongoing coursing life of mind and heart, which is so thrilling. It's history without the dates and the facts and the battles. Some of those are there, but it's history of the heart and of our struggles to make sense of things.
Wow. Melissa, would you talk a little bit about how this community of poets and poetry influences your work? And
Yes. Yeah, I think, there's this generosity of spirit, whether we're communing with poets who are still alive or not. that their very work is inviting us into considering our own work anew and how we might, grow and learn and expand from that. I think that being in this rather small community, having the opportunity to be in this low residency MFA program at Pacific University really invited me into the confidence that a literary ecosystem can bring, that we can buoy each other up, that we can celebrate each other's words and learn from each other's words and borrow, as I think we've all done, from poets whom we admire so greatly. Everything we read today had snippets of this flair, the other's words, the other's thoughts, perhaps their way of seeing the world, and it's just so rich. And I think something else that I just want to know is that when COVID happened and things were so shut down, this weird world of Zoom, became this conduit for poetry that I don't know, could any of us have foreseen the way that we can be together across time and space and be able to celebrate poetry the way we do, whether it's participating in a workshop or a reading or zooming in to hear something or tapping back on a recording of something. It seems to me that the ecosystem of poetry has grown in this way that's just almost without limit nowadays, and it's such a gift to us wherever we are.
Absolutely.
I want to invite people to put questions in the chat if they'd like to. And, I do really agree with you, Melissa. It's opened up a world to me. I started this on Zoom in, June of 2020 because I was feeling so isolated and I had just retired and wanted to delve into poetry, but I just have expanded my world in this way. So I think, somebody in the chat is asking you, Melissa, if you have a collection of poetry coming out soon.
There's a manuscript submitted out there in the world, so we will see. Hopefully.
So we're hoping there's a publisher on this chat that's looking for it. Mark, you said that you and Diane had wanted this conversation to happen about these past poets. Can you talk a little bit to me about what it is that you are looking for to delve into together?
It's hard to name exactly. It's when we respond to a poet so strongly, I think it's because we feel so much of what we want to know and what we want to gain some perspective or understanding about ourselves. And it's talking to someone else about it. Somebody else who loves that work can be a way of unpacking it. Have you seen this? Have you thought about that? And bringing forth whatever questions we carry or thoughts we carry about the work of a figure of the past is a way of getting closer. And, the history of how people dealt with being mortal, how they dealt with love, how they dealt with loss, how they dealt with frustration didn't exactly start, with us. And so this great treasury of all the things that people have thought and felt and given shape to, that's ours. And it's unfortunate that it sometimes seems to gather dust in, the sort of codified tomes of the academy when it really should be part of our exchange. It's our heritage, It's one of the great things that was left to us. A lot of, not so great things were left to us too, but that is something we really can give each other and work with and share.
Mark is one of my zillions of influences. And even though we're probably about the same age, I taught his work every year. And the poem that you did on the Poetry in Motion, that part of the longer poem, I believe, isn't it?
What was it? I don't know what it was.
Oh, okay. So you're naming it was about AIDS, and all the losses, and you're naming this hand and this hand and this hand. That just had a huge impact on me and my students. And the connection, I think, of the work that you were doing, writing about AIDS in New York, and that I experienced as well, with similar losses. Um, it gave me a pathway. I mean, why do we read each other? It plowed a pathway for me to walk. Yes, my own voice enters the picture, but you lit the way. And
I'm honored by that.
and for my students too. I also remember the book, the source book, and the title poem, and this sense that through language alone you could locate and tunnel your way to the source. These are things that had a profound impact on what I thought a poem could do.
Thank you, Diane.
Hmm.
I remember it would have been about 1990. I gave a reading in Cambridge. It was a group of people who were writing about the AIDS epidemic, and Marie Howe was in the audience. And we had just met glancingly, but that night we really met. And Marie says that she found out that she could write poems about her brothers dying on that night. And what I found out listening to Marie was you can have your friends walk into a poem and say something, and how important that is. You can quote that dialogue. It has so much to do with, it reveals so much about character and the moment and what matters to people. So, that kind of exchange really makes poetry go.
Mhm.
There's an interplay that's happening, sort of like what you talked about, Melissa, with Danusha Lamaris and her talking about her child and how that opened up the permission in you.
We know that interplay can happen in the present, and it also can happen in relationship to the past. I mean,
Yeah.
distance avails not, time avails not.
There is a question from Bruce Spang here. He says, I'm wondering as I listen to each of you, how you found a space or a person who allowed you to be in the poetic language as the language was in you. How the poets or mentors imbued in you a way to live and speak poetically. I think once one slips into loving language and what words can do, one will find it impossible to extract themselves.
Question.
Mhm. I'll quickly just mention that this idea of the long-armed poem that Ellen Bass often talks about and often lifts up Frank X. Gaspar, one of her good friends, and his work. The titular poem of Late Rapturous in particular is a great example of this, but a lot of poems by Frank, and particularly in that collection called Late Rapturous, have these giant long arms, and they're sweeping so much in. And I think that there's something about relishing the language of something like that, for me at least, that has invited me to not just relish it as a reader, but to practice it as a writer. What is happening syntactically on the page? What about the diction? What's going on here between one line and the next that is making this kind of forward motion that's so compelling and so inviting? It's not just the long arm details, but there's this sort of rhythm that happens with this kind of stream of consciousness speaking on the page that I think has really been something that's fascinated me lately, and that I'm fully engaged in swimming in, as Bruce is saying. I think where's that line where we're in it so deeply that we kind of can't do anything but be in it. I'm just going to swim around in this forever, and that is something that really has been inviting for me. Yes, I see people putting Frank's name in the chat. He has quite a few poems at the New Yorker you can find online. And then his collection, Late Rapturous, is one that is a particularly great example of what I'm talking about.
I think that we maybe don't always get that from one person, but that you find bits and pieces of it everywhere, and you take from all these examples what you can use and what you need. The permission to be one's idiosyncratic self, the permission to sound like you, the permission to make a mess if you're going to make a mess before you make something better. To screw up, yeah, to boldly go.
Are you saying
Doesn't stop.
Captain Kirk was an influence, Mark?
Well, Um, who was a great influence was Stanley Kunitz, and what particularly it was becoming friends and walking around his garden together, and Stanley looking at this little glade down the rocks and the shadows and saying, "That's where Persephone entered the underworld."
God.
You move to a different kind of inhabitation of the garden there, knowing, paying attention to creative people and being lucky enough to meet a few as a child. And I was really looking for some difference. And I think especially for, a little queer kid, you don't fit in this world. Who does? Where's a place where you feel like some sense of possibility and freedom? So, my mother's art teacher who did outrageous deco self-portraits with Afghan hounds and just, yeah. And who loved the colors of the yarn she sold and making molten glass and stretching it, I didn't define that.
I come from a very different world. I come from a rural working class family and town.
Mhm.
There weren't poets for me to meet until Conrad Hilberry, who many people haven't heard of, but I think, Mark, you've met him, right? But he should be heard of. He was a great Michigan poet. But he came to my high school in a Poets in the Schools thing for rural, underserved schools. And he had seen a poem of mine from my guidance counselor. And he said, "Where's this Diane Seuss character?" He came to my school to find me because in that, he wasn't doing his gig in that school. It was nearby. And he said, "Do you have more of those poems?" And I said, "Well, yeah, they're in my dad's old briefcase." My dad was a teacher. And he said, "Well, let's do a reading." And so we did. And then he started sending me books. And he didn't let up. He didn't stop there. He helped me get money to go to college. So I'm talking at the sort of dirt level, bottom line, school in a cow pasture level of, it was always in me. That's why I think so much of my work takes off from the imagination, because I had to find it. But he made space for me. There's so many of us who exist outside the margins of the academy and of the literary world, who so many people who will never have been heard from because they didn't have one of those
Yeah.
people who shoved away the weeds and helped them come in to learn something. So I try to do that for others, especially for people who don't have traditional access to those wonders that we're talking about.
Hmm. Charles Simic came to my high school when he was quite young then, and we were an early beneficiary of Poets in Schools. And my creative writing teacher in high school said, "Mark, read Mr. Simic one of your poems." And I knew his work. I was reading him. I loved him. And so I did. And he looked at me with his little round glasses and he said in his lovely Eastern European accent, "Read me another one." No better thing could have been said. And it's one of those things. On his part, maybe that's just a casual gesture of recognition, but it meant the world to me.
Mm-hmm.
And still doesn't.
Yeah.
What a gift to be seen in that
Mm-hmm.
way.
No,
And that somebody reaches out a hand, because we all have the potential gift of the imagination and language
Mm-hmm.
that we hear. It's not a a, a, a unique thing to only a few, but not everybody gets nourished to grow that. And in many cases, I think education does the opposite.
It's a very vulnerable time too, especially for people in the margins. A person can say, a well-known poet, for instance, can say something that just dashes their hopes.
Mm-hmm.
We are very powerful, you know? And I mean, I heard things that would make your hair curl, that just made people feel terrible about themselves. So we can do both. It's an extraordinary position to be in.
There's a woman in the chat, Mary Mulholland, asking, what poetry advice do you wish your young self had received?
Ooh.
Mhm.
Well, I would say what we need to do is follow what we love and what told us, and we don't have to explain it and we don't have to justify it. I think in some ways I got encouraged to do that. Maybe I heard more shoulds than I should have, but I also felt I could really make my own way. And maybe, and of course, there were times that it didn't work or it wasn't interesting to anybody else, but or interesting to editors, but I felt some faith in doing that. Like it was a necessity. And I think that comes from having been around artists who were going to do what they were going to do and seeing some beauty in that dedication. That was not that was available to me. I was very grateful for that.
Mhm.
I don't know if I don't have a better answer that do.
I mean, that's a sense of getting a permission slip.
Yeah,
That you could write yourself a permission slip to be yourself and
yeah.
not
And
have to perform to be somebody that you weren't.
writing anybody else's poems is not going to be a very satisfying thing to do.
Yeah. And I think, Diane, you're so right. It just takes the small gesture sometimes to encourage someone or to shut them down, maybe forever. And there's so
Yeah.
many people, you both talked about people in your lives who gave that permission. That's so huge. And I was lucky enough to have that too. One of my grandfathers in particular would say when we went to Sunday dinner at their house, choose a book off the shelf, take one book home. And I also grew up in a small farm town, and it was such a gift to be able, and he wasn't interested in censoring me either. I was a reader as a child. I think it was kind of a bit of an invitation into imagination and escape, and I could read for hours, and he would be someone who would say, take whatever you want. So there I was reading Edna St. Vincent Millay that I probably wouldn't have met for years until college, or, taking home a book, Whitman, and trying it on, seeing, how does this sound? How does it feel? And the football coach at our little rural high school was taught electives in Shakespeare and poetry. And everyone wanted in because he was the football coach and he was giving everyone permission to consider these things, and I think it was just this gift to so many people who might not otherwise have ever, taken a class called Shakespeare. And there we were reading it all together. And it was great. And it did, I think, influence many people.
Another thing that I think is very helpful to young writers is if you can go past, that's great. You say, look how you did this.
Mm-hmm.
Recognition and praise aren't the same thing. And recognition is really naming, here's a way that you made something wonderful. And the more people can show us that, the better equipped we are to keep making.
Yeah.
I think, when the question was, what's poetry advice I wish I'd gotten as a kid or as a young
Right.
person? Yeah, I probably very concrete stuff like um, find a way to make a living that doesn't do you in,
You know,
you know, and doesn't extinguish your imagination if you
Mhm.
can. And You don't have to get married. You know,
Mm.
there are other ways of being in the world.
Mm.
And yeah, just really concrete things about how to function in the world as a creative person. Because, it ain't easy, right? Out there. Um, you know, if I reverse that question to what I want to say to young writers now,
Hmm.
one thing I feel really pretty strongly about is to stop getting their influences on the internet. Um,
I-
and, the poetry world has become, and believe me, I'm not talking about these experiences, but this kind of circle, daisy chain of influence of contemporaries listening to each other and approving or disapproving and then following the
Mm.
approvals. And I think it's a very dangerous way to come into writing. So maybe I'm a little old school in saying, pull the book off of Grandpa's shelf if Grandpa has books, or find the book in the library and read the old stuff and learn, who your elders are and what you came from. And then from that foundation, there's so much to do. There's so much you can do. I mean, I'm talking about, punk rock and, my son's addiction and all kinds of real world present day stuff. But my foundation is in the people I needed that I found. So I wish for them maybe that sort of innocence or evil innocence of being a kid who has to be a detective to their literary needs and influences.
What do you think was the best advice? Did you get any piece of advice that stayed with you or that mattered?
Hmm.
I'll
Um,
let Melissa go.
Ellen read some of my early poems when I was first working with her and said, Melissa, be precise with your language. And that made a big impression right away,
Hmm.
you know?
Um, William Stafford said to me, I was like 17 or something. He said, well, I have a feeling these are poems in heaven, but they're not poems on earth yet. And it's so fine to me because he sort of he saw something I was trying to do or something I could conceive, but he just showed me I didn't have the chops to do it. And that didn't hurt. That was like really useful to me.
Say again what he said to you.
He said, I have a feeling these are poems in heaven, but they're not poems on earth yet.
What a thing to say.
That was
That
great.
sounds like him too, from what I've read of him,
Very
of
generous.
his work.
Well, it was very complimentary. These are
Huh.
Yeah.
lofty
Hmm.
poems. These are
There's something
beautiful
here.
poems. They just need to
Body.
be
Well,
done,
they still
right?
they made their way to Earth, Mark,
Yeah,
They
and
sure
heaven
did.
and
Not those
all
particular
places
poems,
between.
but some of them did.
we're all grateful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a really good piece of advice. Yeah, my mentor, Conrad Hilberry, I got mad once because somebody was sort of imitating my work, somebody in college,
Mm.
and I said to him, if she's friggin' quoting lines of mine and saying they're hers, and he just sort of wasn't having it. He said, "Get over yourself," basically, and it's a compliment. Move on, you
Mhm.
know. And I think he was a very humble person. And I think just his air of humility, he was humble, but he wasn't a pushover. And that taught me a great deal. You know, get over yourself, Di.
Nice.
Conference with a poet who shall remain nameless, who the night before my cat had gotten hit by a car, and it was really heavy carrying that, and was upset when I went to the conference. And I told the poet this, and that person said, "Well, I just think it's a waste that it's too bad that people waste so much love on animals that they could be giving to other people." And immediately I thought, I don't care what you think. It does not matter to me what you think about my poems.
Hmm.
That's an instruction. This is a moral art, right? And and I want to be able to see the humanity of the critic or the reader. If you're going to tell me how to practice this art, you want to be a decent person in the process, or I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Yes,
Wow.
yes, decency.
Yeah.
And you can be indecent in poems, believe you me.
I don't mean a poem. That could be all right. It's just don't hurt
Just
somebody.
don't be a shit to other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
there's a bunch more questions in the chat, and we only have a few more minutes, so I'm trying to kind of scan through. There's one from Carla Sarah that I think this is to you, Diane. She says, when I read Modern Love, I was stunned by the line, but objectivity itself, that was beautiful. It seems the antithesis of romanticism, and would you comment on that?
It is in ways, isn't it? But I do think, Keats saw the nightingale finally for what, even though he languaged it, he saw it. He looked very closely at the world, and but also it's his ghost in the poem. He's learned some stuff from being dead, and he has come to the realization that a lot of the sort of traps of the flesh that he fell into, even his thing with Fanny, which, he was a kid. He was a kid, you know. Um, Even his love for Fanny, it he was able to see with the wisdom of death that he could be objective about her, that he didn't have to fall into sort of gloppy romanticism, but that there's still beauty. Truth is beauty, right? And beauty, truth.
Mm.
And the truth, objectivity that comes through in objectivity, in the concrete, in being objective about other human beings. Through the process of this book during the pandemic, I did find that there was a lot, I really was questioning, is poetry viable? Can it do anything? And I think that poem, among a few others, as I chipped through this book, said it can, even especially maybe if what it helps you to do is to come to something objectively beautiful, that you're not over personalizing, maybe.
Hmm.
It was really kind of tempering my own soul.
Mm. It's beautiful how your poem High Romance really enacts what you're saying, Diane. I'm so glad that you read that.
Thank you.
Mm.
Yes, so we're at 5:30 already. And there are other questions that we didn't get to, but I want to thank everybody who came and engaged in that way. And I particularly want to thank the three of you for coming on and reading and talking about these influences in poetry. And I just feel so enriched by this reading and this conversation and that ability to connect with each of you. Thank you so much for being
Thank you,
here.
Meg. And Melissa, can I just say I love your work and your poems about your son. It's so hard to write about children effectively, and you did it. beautifully, and with a great deal of love and power and even objectivity. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thanks to all three of you for including me in these.
Thank you,
Hello.
Mark.
Thank
Really
you.
good company. Thank you all so much.
Ah, thank you. Mm.
Bye all.
Bye. Take